thank you for having this nice talk with me, which means a lot to my students and also to my seminar about the interconnection between sound and music and art and different environments. One can imagine that there are very lot actors maneuvering and exchanging in these kinds of dispositive. So we will try to unlock some of the hermeneutic challenges that come along with the description criteria. I would I would argue, Jill, one of the most prominent discourses you led in the last decades was the notion of embodiment and also the notion of tacit knowledge. This is also laid bare in your work as an artist, where you explore the pragmatics of our senses, like smelling, tasting, seeing, hearing, touching, with the aesthetic nature of all the senses embedded in an artful way. You also are at the University of Arts in Zurich. You look at different biological systems and try to find, I call them tacit dots between disciplines in order to render visible what lies beneath these connections of knowledge and aesthetics. So with all this in mind, my very first question to you, very obvious one, is how would you describe how this need of yours came into being to search for connection between art and science?
Okay. Well, I think I've always been interested in the human body in my work and in body politics. So for me, it was really interesting to start to explore this kinds of notions. And I did a project at the ZKM for the opening of the ZKM in '98. And in that project, I looked at the interskin, it was called. It looked at the relationship between the human genome and the way in which we interpret it. And so I became fascinated with, after a while, with exploring the senses. And I went to, at first, because I'm interested in technology and the way in which technology affects our bodies, I became fascinated with the idea of embodiment. And then I went into this artist in artificial intelligence lab to actually look up into the possibilities of mimicking skin with electronic interfaces. And so this was the idea of that project. I worked with Daniel Bissek there on developing skin interfaces for visually handicapped and impaired participants in a kind of theater situation. And from this, we built a lot of sculptures, if you like, interactive sculptures about skin. So my first introduction to science was really about looking into why the skin feels.
Ich bin gern nass und ich habe das Geräusch sehr gern von Regen, der auf mich fällt. Ich liebe den Geruch, den die Feuchtigkeit mit sich bringt. Ich spüre es, wenn ihr Menschen auf mir herumtrampelt. Wenn ihr meine Pflanzen, meine Oberflächen, meine Haut zerstört oder mich maschinell bearbeitet. Ich gebe euch Nahrung. Jetzt wollt ihr jeden Zentimeter von mir nutzen, ganz anders als früher. Könnt ihr euch noch erinnern, wie es war, als ihr Kind war?
What kind of particular sensory perceptions exist within our skin structure that can be mimicked, biomimicked, or biomimicked, really, with sensory interfaces. And so that was the beginning of my interest in really working with scientists. And that since then it's led to a whole number of other residencies based on the sensory perception in neuroscience, but also in ecological sciences.
There is no otherworldly experience of something else which isn't framed already by something that is formed within our body and within our senses. And speaking of music, the feel for rhythm, the feel for sound, the feel for patterns is in a way very, very, very old, I would guess. And somehow the connection between our perception, our senses and the body and everything that frames our surrounding or our perception of the surrounding is a constant interchange that cannot be just described by us and them or us and the world outside, because it's constantly fluid state.
I think it's a very big, actually, Rolf Pfeiffer from the AI lab said something very interesting. He said once, well, the body shapes the way we think. And I think that's a very important statement, that without a body, we don't exist in our environment or in our situation. So, and our sound ability is like hyper intensive for that experience. It's a very important experience. So that's why I worked with people who had to use sound for navigation, for orientation, for understanding where they are in space, and for reacting to local environments.
Es ist laut in der Stadt. Die sind ständig in Bewegung, mobil, in Hektik und rastlos. Überall Baustellen und Abgase in der Luft, tonnenweise. Die Sommer sind heiß. Wir nehmen die Hitze auf in unsere Flachdächer und unsere Mauern und werden zu richtigen Öfen, auch lang nach Sonnenuntergang.
The idea is by mimicking our sensory perception of the skin, which means temperature, pressure, vibration, actuation, proprioception. These are all parts of our skin interface and natural interface. But I mean, in the AI lab, they're interested in building robots, and therefore skin was part of this sensory perception thing they were very interested in, because how sounds change over time is related to the ecology of sound and related to the fact that our impact, what is our impact on the environment and how is that changing the sound around us? That was the first exercise. And then the second exercise was about what sounds do you feel really keep this forest alive, what sounds do you feel are part of your city, part of your environment? When you are in your environment, how do you recognize where you are? When you start to combine it, then you also start to interpret it. And so consequently, you often add a layer of interpretation. Like, for example, in oral roots, I had these sounds from that I had soundtracks that people had recorded by syncing microphones into the wombs of women who agreed to have those microphones to sort of mimic what it might sound like an embryo in the room, when you are in the womb of the mother. But I mean, it's somewhat interpretive, because of course, do we really know that? You know, do we really know what those sounds are? So there's some things you have to semi-fabricate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite sure you can somehow recreate the way of sounds of an embryonic state, but it's almost impossible to recreate the phenomenology that comes along with being in that embryonic state itself. This has also very much to do with tacit knowledge, or a kind of learning. We are learning by perceiving.
In my artworks, I always employ touch to trigger sound samples or to gather the material. And it's very important, because what we discovered is that people who have even learning difficulties learn better with tacit knowledge. So tacit interaction, touch-based interaction, physical interaction makes a big difference to the way you retain information as well as the way you receive it. I just finished a big project on taste and smell that was part of the European Union project, 2020 Horizon project, called the CHIC project. And in that project, it was so important for me to spend very intensive times kind of hanging around the scientists and working, sort of shadowing all their procedures in the lab. And as part of that, I do kind of visual diaries of those experiences that turn into documentary films.
How would you say, is the term graspable at all when it comes to nature and art?
Well, I mean, creativity is a process. I think that's something that maybe is underestimated. So basically, I mean, I think for me, I mean, I think everybody does have their own definition of creativity. I don't think there's a universal concept, but I do think it's a process of having an idea what something will feel like, look like, be like, sound like in the end, and then trying to get there. So it's almost like visionary in that way. You know, you have a potential idea of what could be, and then the creative process is how to get there.
Kind of a playful pragmatism then.
Exactly. And I think that it's not only confined to the arts. I mean, I think there's I found a lot of creative processes in science. So anything to do with a research hypothesis is also along those lines, you know. I wonder if I could cure tinnitus, you know. I could try and process, I could try this approach, that approach. It's a process, creative process to get to that point of
for all we know about nature and our thoughts about nature itself is a very in a sense creative environment, because nature simulates a situation and creates a situation, and then it evolves again, and then it simulates a new situation which could solve the problem and adapts to a new environment and adapts to a new situation. Some of the creativity fail, some of the creations grow too much or grow in a false direction, and this is a sense of aiming at a certain point, as you mentioned.
But you know what I think is this adaptation, which is part of evolution. In nature, I think it might be starting to be affected by our impact, and this is the big issue. Right, you know, I did a project where I researched a lot on the species in the barrier reef and how they're being affected by water acidity and about the changing environment that they depend on. The symbionts they depend on, like coral, depends on symbionts to be alive in it or to keep it alive. So these things are really fragile. And it's this fragility that we have to relearn about. We have to think very seriously about our impact and the fragility on the environment, our impact on the fragile environment. And I think humans could learn a lot, really, about behavior from nature. But I do think I don't really understand why we don't.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay.